The most ambitious mod for EU4, the Extended Timeline mod, offers the highest amount of flavor, replayability, and overall content for this game. So if you haven't tried it out yet, check out this video and see what it's all about. If we get 10,000 likes, we're gonna do a playthrough as the Byzantines after the Battle of Manzikert using this particular mod. So we might even be able to tip the faith and prevent the empire from collapsing to the Turks. And I am trying to reach 115,000 subscribers by the end of the month. If we do get that, I'll convince my wife to play some EU4 on camera for all of us to enjoy. When we get into the menu, the first thing you see is that we start from 58 AD. It can go all the way up to 9,999 and even has the present day date, the fall of USSR, Cold War, Second World War, First World War, and pretty much all the various historical events that played a major role in our history and shaped the world that we know. I want to mention that the borders are probably the most accurate borders and province shapes that I've seen in a mod so far. They have in fact the actual borders that are usable in the modern day. So if we scroll over to 2021, you can actually see pretty well defined borders here. Moldova with Romania, for example, have almost 100% accurate borders, as do most of the nations of the world, be them in Europe, Africa, and oh my dear lord, that's a lot of new tags in Africa, isn't it? They've added, I think, around 100 plus new provinces so that they can actually simulate the real borders of countries throughout history, or at least the closest to the most accurate versions of borders. There's a lot of new religions in the game as well. For example, we have irreligious and secular. Irreligious is basically atheism, I believe, and agnosticism put in together. Secularism as well, although I'm not sure Turkey would qualify as a secular nation after a certain person took charge recently. It even adds Kawarish, which is basically a replacement for Ibadi, if I'm not mistaken, and changes the cultural makeup so you actually have accurate, like 100% accurate culture groups. As you can see here, Romanian is its own culture, Hungarian is its own culture, Albanian, even though it's just 4 or 5 provinces, it is its own culture, as is Basque, for example. The Celtic group includes the Bretons, the Welsh, Cornish, Irish, and Highlander. The Maghreb is separate. Turkish is also separate from the various Arabic groups and is in the same group with Turkmeni, Azerbaijani. We even have Oirat, which simulates the Oirat tribes that actually migrated to this area a few hundred years prior and still exist there today as a bit of a minority, but still they exist. And there's still some Oirats in Mongolia proper, which are depicted in this area too. The Kazakh group is separate from the Mongolian group, which again is very accurate. The Tibetan group is its own group as well. Indonesian is together with Malaysian. Filipino is separate. Thai, Laotian. You know what? I'm actually realizing this is the most accurate culture group wise mod that I've seen so far. Not even joking. This is the most accurate one I've actually seen to date. Pretty much everything is the way that it's supposed to be. I haven't seen anything that is inaccurate in any way, shape, or sort. Even Latvian with Lithuanian together, and Estonian, Ingrid, and Finnish in a separate group, separate from the other groups as well, and separate from Hungarian. Despite Hungarian being linguistically a part of the Finno-Ugric group, I do agree that culturally speaking they are very different from the Finns, as they've been separated for more than 1,000 years. So it makes a lot of sense for this to be its own unique culture group. Not sure how I feel about the Dutch being in the same group as the Germans. I do think that there are significant differences, linguistically speaking, culturally speaking as well, some differences, but I assume that this is done simply because when the game starts and throughout the majority of history, Dutch was pretty much the same like Germanic, only massive differences occurring very recently in the past couple of 100 years in reality. When it comes to cultural accuracy, I will give this a 10 out of 10, hands down. Apparently they forgot to add the small Gaza Strip here, but that's not a big deal because obviously it's just them trying to minimize the amount of provinces they add, otherwise the game would be unplayable. You do have Palestine here together with Israel, which is a good touch because I know a lot of mods do not add this when it comes to modern day maps, and I'm happy to see a fair depiction of both of these countries in there. Yemen's got the rebels to simulate the situation it's in right now, as does Ethiopia have the rebels to simulate the civil war that's going on in Ethiopia as we speak, by the way, guys. And let's hope that everything goes well and it finishes soon and there's not going to be too much more of war in that country. I believe that everywhere where there's some sort of conflict right now, they've simulated that in the 2021 map with rebels. And the second secular religion, whichever country has the secular religion, it basically accepts all religions equally. So it's like the best religion to have, because there's no debuffs based on whatever religions you have in provinces if you are secular. There's so many different start dates here and so many juicy ones from a historical point of view. I wish I could cover all of them in this video, but that would take me a few hours for sure. So let's just go ahead and take the rise of Islam, one of the most interesting periods in human history. So the 630 AD start date obviously is the date when the Rashiduns started their expansion, the advent of the Islamic faith, with Muhammad being 60 years old of age apparently at this start date. So let's actually get into the game. The main theme of this start date obviously is religion, because, well, it is the time when there was massive religious changes around the world. The Rashiduns spreading the newly founded faith of Islam, or Muslim as it's called in the game here. Prior to this, the Arabian Peninsula, religiously speaking, was a mixture of Jewish, mostly Nestorian Christians, but there were some Chalcedonians as well, and the pagan faiths that they had before as well, which here is depicted as South Arabian faith. I like that there's still Egyptian faith around, that is the Pharaoh religion, the one with all of the ancient gods, Ra, Isis, Osiris, and so on. And then it is true actually that in 630 there were still some of these around in Egypt, but Miaphysite was the main Christian branch that was dominant in Egypt at the time. Chalcedonian was the official religion of the Roman Empire. We know them as the Byzantines, but they called themselves the Roman Empire back then. And in 630, the reality is they still spoke majority Latin in the empire, so they were still the Roman Empire. Byzantium is the name that we gave them after the Holy Roman Empire appeared, and Germanic sources tried to legitimize the Holy Roman Empire as the true successor and tried to say that the Eastern Roman Empire is not the successor of Rome. That's why they started calling them the Byzantines in certain records, and we also in modern times refer to them as the Byzantines to differentiate the Greek-speaking Roman Empire from the Latin-speaking Roman Empire. Or in EU4, that's also a thing. Definitely a very interesting start date. We still have the Visigoths in Spain, the Lombards, and remember that the Visigoths eventually would get conquered by the Muslims during Muhammad's reign. The Rashidun Caliphate, which is the first Islamic caliphate, only conquered most of the Arabian Peninsula, with some parts still belonging to the Sassanids by the end of his life. But eventually, after he passed away, his descendants would capture Egypt at first, with the Syrian and Jordanian parts. Then they would also go into the Iraqi parts, destroy the Sassanids, all of the North African, the Maghreb, and much later also the Iberian Peninsula. Well, most of the Iberian Peninsula would be conquered by the Muslim caliphates. There was even an early siege of Constantinople by the Rashiduns in the 7th century. And the reality is that in 630, the Byzantines and the Sassanids just came out of a massive war that lasted for an entire generation. So that means the entire manpower pool of the Byzantines and the Sassanids was done. Those guys had close to no young fit soldiers for war, and they would need at least 20 to 30 more years to recover their army strengths, because it doesn't work the way that it works in EU4 where you get 1,000 people a month. It worked very different in real life, and to put it into perspective, you'd probably get like 20 people a month with an empire of this size. That's why you needed a lot of time to recover your manpower. And luckily for the Rashiduns, once the Byzantines and the Sassanids killed each other's army pool and destroyed each other's nations, they just swooped in and crushed both sides quite easily, as they had a fresh manpower pool and they had a lot of experienced soldiers from the multiple wars they've previously had in the Arabian Peninsula. Not to mention, they had religious zeal, which is one of the most underrated yet most powerful tools in any historical army's arsenal. I.e., remember, the Roman Empire used to be pagan. They changed to Christianity because of Constantine the Great's army was majority Christian, and he made the strategic move of converting the empire to Christianity to empower his army and make them fight like absolute mad lads. And they did. They won every battle they needed to win in order to make Constantine the greatest known emperor in the Christian faith. That is, he is the one that basically allowed for Christianity to be the official religion of the empire. And by the way, Chalcedonian was the official version of Christianity in 630. There were still Arians around and a few others, even some Hellenics in the Balkans and in the North African parts. But by 630, 30, majority of the empire was definitely Chalcedonian. There were Nestorians around too. Zoroastrians were around. It was the official religion of the Sassanids. Tangri as well, you might find very familiar. Hindu, Confucian, the various Buddhist branches. Romuva you might know in Suomensko, and even Norse, as well as the pagan Germanic faith that were very, very similar to the Norse faiths in reality. Some amazing things that this mod brings are a lot of scripted events that actually offer a ton of flavor. We even have missions. The Rashidans have their own mission tree, and it's quite a nicely well made mission tree for that matter. A lot of new decisions here that you can see right now. There's a ton of new ages. We have the classical age at the start of the game, a late classical age, a migration age, which is essentially when the Roman Empire came down onto its knees, the Dark Ages, which is where we are right now. It was called the Dark Ages because after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, after 476, up until Renaissance pretty much, the western part of Europe was basically descent into an age of darkness from a literary perspective and from a technological perspective. It was not the most shiny moment for this area, and it is similar to what happened in freaking Eastern Europe during communism, okay? I said it, alright? I said it. Got feudal age after, high middle ages, late middle ages, age of discovery, and all the ones you know from base EU4, followed by industrial, Great War, and information ages. Each of them come with their own unique bonuses and unique abilities for certain special nations. I like that Tibetan Empire gets 5 discipline here. Frankish states get governing capacity, and the Rashiduns, as you would expect, get core creation cost -15 to help with the really fast expansion that you can do as the Rashiduns. You also get a special Rise of Islam modifier that offers morale of armies, manpower recovery, and manpower overall, discipline plus 10%, and cost for units -30. Absolutely massive, and it's going to help out so much in expanding. There's also a permanent claim on all of these areas here, so if you're fast enough, within just 10 to 15 years you can conquer all of this, as historically Khalid ibn Walid actually did, together with the other famous Islamic generals such as Amr ibn al-As and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. If you didn't hear about them, look it up. They're actually extremely important and some of the best generals that history has ever seen. I also want to see how well the AI behaves with this mod, and that's why I'm just going to let the AI play by itself. I want to see if the Rashiduns actually manage to expand and at least conquer the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so apparently from some events they actually can annex the nations here without actually directly attacking them, because this area was not theirs before. I'm assuming that's the case with most of the Arabian nations, or maybe some of the Arabian nations. Let's leave this on speed 5 and see what happens, shall we? Okay, they're not drilling anymore. That's telling me that they're gonna go to war, and they did go to war already. Holy mother of Schnapples, Ghatafan is the first target of the Islamic conquests over here. Instant annexation, apparently. There you go. They even have Khalid ibn Walid and Amir ibn al-As as the 3-star generals of these armies. Not gonna lie, that's a pretty sweet and quick expansion in Arabia, man. They basically already took all of the Arabian lands in less than a year. Literally the only thing left now in Arabia is the Omani area together with the Sassanid areas. I'm curious how they're gonna actually behave against the Byzantines and the Sassanids, because these are proper big nations. So, oh, they went to war with the Byzantines. Rashidun jihad against Byzantium. Oh boy, we're gonna see some thick battles over here, boyos. Pretty historical, I should say, taking over these areas first, munching into Egypt. And look at this, regions are defecting to the Rashiduns once they get occupied. That is very interesting. I have not seen a mod do that before. I'm actually curious how they scripted that in. Right now, the Rashiduns have 45,000 troops, whilst Byzantium's got 75. So the Byzantines still do have more troops, but I think that the Byzantines have another war in Matrega. Okay, so they're occupied in Europe basically right now, whilst the Rashiduns are basically kicking everybody's ass. There's Byzantine particularists, interesting. And they finished off the rest of the Arabian Peninsula whilst at war war with the Byzantines. Whoa! This really makes me want to play as the Byzantines in this timeline to see if I can actually stop the Arab onslaught. Because look at this, provinces are defecting to the Rashiduns without a peace treaty. So I'm assuming if they keep this under control for a while, all of it is going to basically belong to the Rashiduns before the peace treaty even starts. That also explains how they can actually make the Rashiduns expand so fast. The Muslim religion also apparently spreads via events, because this area was not Muslim and it just became instantly Muslim once it was annexed by the Rashidun. Meanwhile, Francia is also starting to expand, especially in the Visigothic lands and a little bit in the British Isles. And at this point, pretty much all of Egypt has defected over to the Rashiduns. The Sassanids just waiting over here for their turn to come. The Byzantines are striking back a little bit. They now are focusing actually on the Egyptian parts, but there's not much to focus on anymore because they pretty much already lost most of Egypt as it is. They are winning the battles though, so I guess the tactic if you play as the Rashiduns is to essentially conquer the provinces, control the provinces, and wait for them to defect and avoid the Byzantine army, I guess. And the Lakhmids have appeared out of the Sassanids. There's a peace treaty between the Byzantines and the Rashiduns. The Rashiduns have taken a massive chunk out of the Byzantines too. They got provinces in North Africa already. They got provinces in Egypt, well, most of Egypt for that matter. The Byzantines have been completely split apart, and rebels will probably do the rest of the work here and break the rest of the Byzantine Empire. Let's see what the next target of the Rashiduns is going to be. I don't know how they're spreading the Muslim religion, but it's not via conversion. From what I noticed, it's just via either event or I don't know how it works, because it's spreading ridiculously fast as well in the newly conquered provinces. Sassanids really struggling with the rebels too, I noticed. I'm really getting the feeling that the Rashiduns in this game are expanding a lot faster than the historical Rashiduns expanded. And there you go, now they're at war with the Sassanids. Amr ibn al-As leading the charge over into the Iraqi areas. And I have to say the Rashiduns are massively outnumbering the Sassanids in this situation here. The Rashiduns have reached 99,000 units, whilst the Sassanids only have 44,000. Absolutely big difference right there. Plus, the whole province's defecting thing makes a massive difference because they're getting a core as well. So it loses the core of the Sassanids and it gains the core of the Rashidun whenever these provinces defect to the Rashiduns. Not to mention, the rate of defecting is super fast. This war barely started and they already have almost all of Egypt here. And even got the fort in Waristan, the main defensive area for the Sassanids. Oh man, they're so done. They're definitely doing a lot more damage to the Sassanids than they did to the Byzantines, however. Well, this pretty much proves to me that the mod is not just a pretty mod, but it's also a very much functional mod with really well scripted events and mechanics. There's also a lot of new idea groups, and you have, for example, early idea groups, the regular idea groups, and some other ones. For example, early admin ideas give you core creation cost reduction, production efficiency, and a lot of other bonuses to help you expand early on. Offensive is basically the same like offensive, but a little bit less bonuses than you would expect from such a group. As you advance in ages, new idea groups will appear, and the best part about the mod, at least from my perspective, is the construction part. You have so many new buildings, starting with the local production from storehouse 25 all the way to 100 for counting houses. There's basically 4 levels. You also have dev cost reduction from factories, coal plants, nuclear plants, fusion reactors. There's naval bases as well, great mosques besides regular mosques and monuments. There's roads as well that can eventually lead to highways, railroads, and mass transit systems that can offer up to 10% friendly movement speed on various terrain, and of course the usual monuments. Deving up provinces in the early game has some modifiers. So you get the Dark Age modifier, which offers 150 extra costs for deving up, which means that earlier on in the game you cannot dev up as much as you would imagine, but as you progress in the game you can start deving up more and more. So the early part of the game would obviously be focused on expansion a little bit more than playing tall, with the mid to late game being focused on playing tall and expanding a little bit too, making for a very interesting game overall. You've seen the cultural makeup of the 2021 start date. Well, this start date also, culturally speaking, is extremely well done. As you can see in the Iberian parts, Basque is a little bit more spread, which was the case in the period, as was the Celtic culture in the British Isles and the West Slavic culture in the the eastern part of modern Germany. Lithuanians also have the old Prussians next to them. Sami is a lot more expanded in the north of Scandinavia and in pretty much all of Russia. If you guys don't know, historically speaking, Russians came to be mostly after the fall of Kiev, when the Mongolians destroyed the famous nation of Kiev and Rus. Some of them stayed behind and eventually became the Ruthenians that we know today. A lot of them migrated north and established various entities in the north. There were still some, and you can see that on the map. You have Novgorodians and Russians in this area. But a few hundred years later is when actually the Russians started colonizing, let's say, and culturally converting most of these lands to their culture via aggressive expansion when they were trying to basically run away from the Mongolians. Because when the Mongolians destroyed Kiev, they really destroyed it. I'm talking about Carthage level here, with a lot of slaughtering and decimation and everything. You wouldn't want to live in the city when it happened. But before it happened, Kiev is said to have been 200 years more advanced than the western part of Europe, with a lot of dark ages, let's say, cultural and technological advances happening in this city. So who's to say, if Kiev did not fall, the world might have been very different. And I'm talking about something that happens a few hundred years afterwards. I should probably just switch the start date for that matter. Avaria is a thing, by the way, and the Avars were Tengri. Their culture did not become a predominant culture in this area. Of course, they are shown as predominant here, but that's definitely debatable, as is the Goths and the Gepids having any sort of majority in these areas, though they have to be illustrated, so I guess it's not a bad idea of showing them like this. Thracian is around because this is prior to the arrival of the Bulgarians in this part. I would say that Romanian and Thracian would definitely be very similar. That being said, Dacian likely would not be a part of this group because Dacian was replaced by Romanian. The word Romanian itself meaning citizen of Rome, and it is basically when the colonization of the former Dacian province happened. It was colonized by mainly legionnaires, and they had to work in the legion for 16 to 30 years. Afterwards, they would get the actual title of citizen of Rome, and they would be so proud of being citizens of Rome that they would like to be called Romans all the time. And in 630, Romanians would not be called Român as we say today in Romania. They would call themselves Roman, which is basically Roman in Latin. They changed the A to U later on when the Slavs arrived, because this area is quite cold and there's a lot of mountains, and there's actually a linguistic process through which languages replace certain vowels to suit their needs. So because this place was very cold, instead of saying Roman, where they open their mouth a lot to say A, they would say Român, because U, you don't open your mouth so much as you do when you say A, and it's less cold getting into your mouth. So they obviously thought it's a great idea that the Slavs use U a lot, since the Slavs obviously came from very cold areas, and this also was a very cold area. Francia is also around. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Franks established their own kingdom here. Eventually, Charlemagne establishes the Frankic kingdom, which breaks apart into three different kingdoms, namely Germany, Lotharingia, and France as we know them today. They probably call themselves East Francia, West Francia, and the Kingdom of Lothar, because it basically was split in three, since Charlemagne had 3 kids and he gave each of them an equal amount of land. That was the inheritance law of the time. In the Asian part, we have the Yamato people, which are the cursors of the modern Japanese people. The Tang dynasty is in charge, and they have the mandate of heaven as well. The Gok Turks are around too. Eventually, these guys would play a very important role in history. We also have the Western Gok Turks and the Uyghurs here, as well as Shuyanto. This was the Chinese name for the people that roamed these lands. They called themselves something very different. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. And of course, this is prior to the unification of this area into the Joseon dynasty, as it was called afterwards. The kingdom of Shilla played a massive role in that unification, by the way. Byzantium has the default mission from EU4 vanilla. That's a little bit surprising, but it's not bad, and I guess it's good to get all these claims early on. Helps the game a lot more, I suppose. Makes it so that if you start as Byzantium, however, it's going to be really hard to lose. We still lose a little bit from certain events that you're going to get and certain battles that we'll have. If you guys enjoyed the video, don't forget, leave a like. If we get 10,000 likes, we'll do that Byzantine Battle of Manzikert scenario. And if you really want to, I was actually even thinking of doing a World War I scenario to see how that plays out in EU4. And if you want that, let's say 12,500 likes, because that's a different number, okay? Also, consider subscribing. I am really trying to get to 115,000 subs by the end of this month. And if we get that, we're gonna get our first ever female EU4 player, my waifu. Also, check out this really awesome Castile video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. And I want to give a very big thank you to all of my channel members, Patreon members, as well as my Twitch supporters. I really wouldn't be able to do this without all of your support. You guys are absolutely amazing.